I'm Bernadette, by the way, and I am the Equality Advisor in Concern Worldwide and a member of the Learning and Practice Group of the Irish Consortium for GBV. This is our last learning event for the year. You'll be glad to hear we're not going to squeeze one in on Friday. But a lot of you are members of the consortium. You know the work that we do. Some of you, this might be your first experience of coming to a learning event, and you're really welcome. And for just to give you a bit of information, the consortium was established in 2005, and it has, I always get this wrong, is it 15 member agencies of development and humanitarian, plus Irish Aid and the Defence Forces. And it's really quite a unique consortium in that way, in terms of we have NGOs and government coming together to look at strategies and mechanisms of working together and collaborating in order to address issues of gender-based violence. We see GBV as a manifestation of gender inequality and a violation of human rights. And it's our work collectively that we're looking to, how do we address this global phenomena. And the work that we do, a lot of it is building capacity within each individual member organisations, but through these learning and practice events, sharing that learning and inviting other interested organisations and individuals to participate in these events. We're also engaged on policy issues in relation to GBV, and we're very involved in the Ireland's National Action Plan on UN Resolution 1325, and are playing a key role in the monitoring of the Irish National Action Plan and engagement in various processes in a number of countries. The post-MDGs, as you know, is a hot topic at the moment. And is an area that the consortium also got involved with earlier this year. We commissioned a piece of research looking at the post-MDG framework and recommendations for the inclusion of GBV into whatever this new framework will be. GBV was totally absent in the MDG framework, and it's something that we've some very clear recommendations in this discussion paper, which is available in the room. And we made a submission to UN Women as well as part of the process around the post-MDG discussions. So our recommendations is, GBV, gender equality needs to be integrated right throughout whatever new framework emerges, but specifically there needs to be some kind of domain relating to gender-based violence. For us, we see that GBV impacts on any progress on any of the MDGs, whether we're talking about health issues or we're talking about education. So without a really strong focus on gender-based violence in the next framework, I think it'll be a missed opportunity. And there's lots of recommendations in that discussion paper in terms of how you can engage in the process, either in Ireland or in the countries maybe your organisation works in. And we'll be utilising the EU presidency for sure in terms of trying to lobby to get our issues on the agenda. So other key things that happened in 2012 for the consortium, we came up with a new strategic plan, and you'll find that on the GBV website. And within that, we're still looking at the whole capacity building, the learning and sharing, the policy issues, but we're also going to look at more engagement within the fields, the countries that we work in, and much more joint hands-on working in a couple of countries. In March earlier this year, for International Women's Day, we actually held an event in this very room, and we focused on health and social consequences of violence against women and girls. And we had speakers from WHO from Geneva and Akidwa in Ireland. If you missed that event and you're interested, we video all of our learning events. So if you have colleagues or friends that are interested and couldn't make it here, direct them to the website www.gbv.ie, and you'll find the recording there. And the learning paper that was produced is also available here and on our website. in September then, we had a film evening in the Lighthouse Cinema, and we're trying to do this every year to try and incorporate different ways of exploring the issues, and utilising film is quite a powerful way of exploring the issues. And we were lucky to have the director of this documentary come and attend for questions and answers, so it was a really quite live event, very traumatic. It was the day I will never forget, if anybody knows it, and it was a documentary about FGM, a very serious issue, a very upsetting issue, and a lot of people go, oh, I don't know if I can go and watch that, but it is, you know, we have to be open to really touching and being close to these issues for us to really understand it. So hopefully in 2013 we'll have another similar film event, and hopefully we'll see some of you there. All in all, I think at this stage we have about 10 learning briefs and discussion papers, so quite a lot of learning gathered over the years, and do access them, share them. They are all based on practice or research, or we really try and emphasize that, you know, learning from experiences. So whether that's an NGO in Uganda doing a lot of community work, or whether it's an academic researcher working with one of the member agencies, it's all really valid. And as we all know, addressing GBV is no easy task. It's an issue that is often silenced, hidden and stigmatized within communities and societies. It often takes place in private spheres, in public, within institutions such as schools, and over time becomes normalized. It's fueled by people in positions of power and the whole power patriarchy, and the influence that has on men and boys, or how they have to conform or adhere to socially constructed notions of masculinities, and how they perform these masculinities, and the pressures that are on them, and the impact that that has on women and girls is hugely significant. And schools are gendered institutions, and Mairead Dunn, who we're so lucky to have here today, she's the director of the Centre, let me get this right, Centre for International Education in the University of Sussex. And she will be talking a lot more about schools as gendered institutions and the impact that that has on issues of violence. But the violence becomes so embedded and normalised that it's really a big challenge to break that cycle. And we hope through these learning sessions that we begin to kind of explore and look at other experiences of organisations that have tried certain approaches, certain strategies. What is the promising practice or evidence from research that exists that can support us in moving forward? As you know, today the focus of the Learning and Practice Seminar is on school-related GBV, and that it's a particular area of focus for a number of the agencies, particularly Consortium Worldwide and Plan International. And, you know, it's important that we realise children's experience of violence and the many spheres and spaces that happens in, whether it's girls experiencing violence on their way to school or in the community. It happens in so many spaces. It's not just about the school space. We've seen recently Malala in Pakistan, you know, who was shot in the head and neck on her way from school because she was openly campaigning about the right to education. And that has really shocked the world, but this is, you know, happening globally at different levels. It's also important for us to recognise that boys, particularly of younger ages, are also susceptible and experience violence, and we need to be really aware of those gender dimensions of violence and not always assume that it's only girls that are affected. A recent study that came out in Liberia showed shocking figures of sexual violence to boys, like over 70%, and I think it's an important thing for us to hold that as well. And all of that, you know, either the experience or the threat of violence results in poor performance of children, their irregular attendance, their dropping out, low self-esteem, and then you have other factors such as early marriage and teenage pregnancy that negatively impact on equality education and their future life chances as human beings. I mean, the fact that 1 girl in 5 in developing countries who enroll in primary school never actually get to complete the education, that 1 in 7 marry before the age of 15, and the impact that this has on their future health, their economic opportunities, their power to make decisions, and their vulnerability to violence. So, you know, the MDGs talked about access to education, which is really important, but like the big issues of like completion, the big issues around the quality of the education, and importantly, the safety that the education, the environment that they're receiving their education in. These are the big questions that we need to move beyond just access. And it's a really complex issue and process, and Mairead will shed a lot more on that. From Concern's perspective, I mean, within our education program, we've seen the importance of focusing on issues around GBV if we're to ensure access and quality and education in a safe environment. And we've been working at a number of different levels, not just within the school, with the students, the parents, the teachers, but also the wider community structures, the Ministry of Education and other government departments and service providers. But for us, in order to kind of move our approaches forward, we kind of felt we're developing a new model of addressing school-related GBV, and we really wanted to see, well, okay, what are other people doing? You know, we're often fall prey to reinventing the wheel and trying out new approaches without actually seeing, well, what have other organisations done, what has been successful, and that's when we commissioned that piece of desk research on promising practice in school-related GBV prevention and response programmes. And we have the full long report. Mairead is going to unpack it a bit for us and bring out some of the key issues, profile some of the organisations and their approaches that they've used. And actually Plan is one of the organisations profiled in the research, along with a few others. So we're delighted that Mairead has actually made it over from the UK. And unfortunately, we were supposed to have Emily from Plan in the UK, and unfortunately Emily got sick, so we're absolutely thrilled, Tanja, that you have managed to, at such short notice, stand into the brief. Plan International has done an awful lot of work in terms of addressing violence in schools, and they've invested a lot in really great research, practice and campaigning through the global I Am a Girl campaign. And so it's fantastic that Tanja is here. Tanja was involved in the recent research on a girl's right to learn without fear, working to end GBV at school. So just to give you a brief in terms of our speakers, Tanja is the Child Rights and Protection Advisor at Plan in Canada. So we're really fingers crossed that the connection lasts for the duration. She's been with Plan since 2010, and in her role she works a lot with the colleagues in her Plan's country programmes, as well as other advisors and managers to strengthen Plan's child rights-based programming. Tanja also contributes to policy dialogue on international and domestic issues related to child rights, child protection, international development. And prior to joining Plan Canada, Tanja was with UNICEF for several years, focused on child protection, early childhood development. And prior to that, she worked for the Ministry of Affairs of Finland in their development policy department. So a whole wealth of experience for us to hear from. Mairead Dunn then is the Director of the Centre for International Education at University of Sussex. Her specific interests are with issues of social and educational inclusion, and she's contributed to scholarship around gender policy and practice in education in a range of national contexts. Informed by theories from sociology, cultural studies, geography and education, she's engaged in intersectional explorations of power and identities, place and space, and the production of knowledge. Her strength has been in accessing rich accounts from various stakeholders and providing analysis of these multiple perspectives as a means to contribute to contemporary debates on policy and practice. I think Mairead has a lot of engagement with colleagues in a lot of the countries that we work in, and I think what's really unique about Mairead is she is an academic, but she's very much grounded and with her peers and NGOs that are working on the ground, and I think that's great to come across an academic that can bring in the theory and also work really well with practitioners. So I'm sure it's going to be an intriguing afternoon. So I think on that note we will begin with Tanja.
Thank you for having me on this short notice. It's interesting for me as one of the co-authors for the report to speak about it globally. Even though when we launched this report recently in Canada, we launched a Canadian edition of the report. So I'm not sure I don't think you have copies there of the report. So just bear with me as I'm presenting it without hard copies in front of you. We will be launching the report globally without this Canadian edition in February at the Commission for the Status of Women in New York. I first want to start off by situating this report in the context of our Because I Am a Girl campaign, which you might have heard of, and plus the global work that PLAN is doing. Even though I'm based in Canada, working for PLAN Canada, we are all united under this global campaign called Because I'm a Girl, and we're working towards the same targets. In October, we released our annual State of the World's Girls report for 2012. And this year we focused on girls' education, particularly what happens to girls when they reach adolescence and their domestic and reproductive roles begin to dominate their lives at the expense of education. This report that we're now releasing, actually this is what it looks like in case you don't have it, it comes on the heels of that other report, but looks more deeply at one of the key barriers preventing girls from successfully transitioning from primary to secondary school, so and accessing a quality education, which is gender-based violence. The report was developed in partnership with the University of Toronto's International Human Rights Program. The findings of the report are based on our careful examination of existing evidence-based research. We did not conduct new primary research. We looked at best practices and policies on gender-based violence in schools in various jurisdictions around the world, and including Canada. We established 8 key global principles, which I'll get into more detail later in the presentation, for framing government action. And to develop these principles, we consulted with over 17 leading organizations, UNICEF, Save the Children, Amnesty. Within Canada, we looked at Canadian Women's Foundation, the White Ribbon Alliance, Human Rights Watch, just to name a few of them, and many child rights experts around the world. We also focused on countries that are internationally recognized for implementing promising practices to prevent, mitigate, and respond to GBV against boys and girls. These countries included Australia, the UK, Philippines, Jamaica, and Swaziland. These countries were recommended to us by the UN Secretary General's Special Representative on Violence Against Children. So they haven't been identified in any report. They were identified for us directly by the SRG's office. Moving forward, we plan to use the findings of this report and the principles outlined as a basis to constructively engage in and enter into dialogue with the countries and governments in which we work. We work in 66 countries. So this includes countries like Canada, where we launched the report because we also took the principles in the global framework and applied it to the Canadian context. Because we know we're not immune in the Canadian context. GBV presents itself in schools here. And even though it manifests slightly differently than in global context, it's still a major issue that needs to be addressed. So the report, in essence, can be applied both in the developing country context and the developed country context because many of the issues are similar. Next slide. So we're on to the definition slide. Sorry, Emily, I forgot to. Suzanne.
That's fine,
Tanya. The definition which we use to define school-related gender-based violence refers to acts of a sexual, physical, or psychological nature inflicted on children in and around schools. This violence is due to stereotypes and roles or norms attributed to or expected of children based on their sex or gendered identity. There are many definitions. This is the one that we're going with. School-related gender-based violence also refers to the ways in which the experiences of violence may be gendered as well. For example, punishment in schools often manifests itself in gendered ways. Boys generally experience more frequent and severe physical punishment, while girls are more likely to be forced to submit to unwanted sexual advances and are more vulnerable to psychological forms of punishment. Both boys and girls are also perpetrators of violence in schools, although the form it takes may differ. Gender norms often dictate that boys should address disputes with peers through physical violence and may also reproduce GBV experienced in their own homes on their female peers at school. Girls are more likely to engage in verbal and psychological forms of aggression. Next slide. GBV can occur in and around school areas or during travel to and from school, as you mentioned in the introduction. Latrines, empty classrooms, and corridors are all potential spaces where violence can occur. Boarding schools, which may offer additional access to girls, for girls that are hard to reach children, may also put students at a higher risk of abuse. Outside school walls, millions of girls and boys are at risk of bullying, rape, unwanted touching, and unprovoked sexual advances in transit to and from school. Your point to Malala's case, along with walking routes, bus stops, and taxi stands. Isolation and a lack of sufficient oversight and management can exacerbate the problem. Next slide. We know that in conflict situations, all negative things are exacerbated. This is the same for school-related gender-based violence, particularly for girls. One child in 3 in conflict-affected countries does not go to school, compared to 1 in 11 in other lower-income countries. In many conflict countries, school children are more likely to be subject to violent attacks. Boys in particular are often targeted for recruitment by armed groups. For girls, the likelihood of sexual violence creates a sense of insecurity about going to school. The use of sexual violence as a weapon of war is also widespread and widely known, and many victims are young girls. Plus, the impact extends far beyond the actual individual survivors. It can cause a serious effect overall on girls' rights, with fear and the breakdown of family and community life becoming barriers to girls' access to education. Next slide. Just a few words on the prevalence. Here are 2 statistics. Worldwide, an estimated 150 million girls and 73 million boys have experienced sexual violence. In some countries, more than 80% of students suffer corporal punishment at school. Next slide. In Mozambique, for example, a government study found that 70% of girl respondents reported knowing that some teachers use sexual intercourse as a condition for promotion between grades. In Niger, a study showed that 88% of teachers confirmed existence of sexual acts between students and teachers at their school. Next slide. In many countries, students use terms such as STMs to refer to sexually transmitted marks, or chalk allowance to which also refers to sexual violence perpetrated by teachers and school staff. Some teachers see it as a benefit. Some teachers, for example, bush allowance or bush stipend is referred to for teachers that are placed in duty stations where they are far away. They should get some type of perk for the hardships they face. The mere use of these terms illustrates how prevalent and widely known this violent behavior is, and how the abuse of power is often used. Next slide. Forms of gender-based violence, school-related gender-based violence include sexual violence, which includes harassment, rape, abuse, coercion, and exploitation. And as I mentioned earlier, 150 million girls and 73 million boys under 18 have experienced this. Incidents of sexual violence by teachers and staff against female students and male students include a range of aggressive behaviors and misuse of authority, including rape, various forms of sexual assault, verbal sexual harassment, and bribing students, as the acronyms refer to. Bullying, often the most common form of violence in schools, reflects an imbalance of power and is carried out through repeated verbal or physical acts, those whose purpose is to inflict suffering over a period of time. Cyberbullying, which we're all becoming more familiar with, extends the same fear, intimidation, and some incidents sexual violence well beyond the school grounds. No longer does it matter that you can't leave the school building, the cyberbullying follows you, or when you leave the cyberbullying, when you leave the school grounds. Students in many parts of the world are routinely subjected to corporal punishment, as those statistics mentioned, as a use of discipline. And teachers are more likely to resort to this punitive discipline under stressful conditions, such as overcrowding in classrooms, insufficient resources, and increased emphasis on student achievement. Next slide. As you mentioned in the introduction, school-related gender-based violence is a complex and many-sided social problem, not only something that results purely from school-related issues. We know that in society in general. Schools reflect a social space that sometimes intensifies the power of relationships, the domination, and discriminatory practices of the wider society. Violence against children in educational settings reflects deeply embedded social and cultural norms regarding authority, hierarchy, discipline, and gender, and other forms of discrimination, which you just referred to in your introduction. So, in order to truly understand the school-related gender-based violence, we must understand the issue of gender-based violence on all different levels, which I'm not going to get into detail here. I just want to highlight a few of the top-level causes for school-related gender-based violence, which include harmful social, cultural, and religious norms. Children are influenced by others' attitudes and behaviors, imitating what they see and behaving in a certain way if people they respect validate those actions. Children who suffer from family violence, for example, are more likely to be bullies or bullied, or likely to be bullies or to be bullied. Children who are vulnerable to violence increases. Children are vulnerable. Their vulnerability to violence increases if they are already from a marginalized group. Disability, sexual orientation. We saw that a lot in the Canadian case with the LGBTQ community. HIV status and membership in a minority group, Indigenous community, or caste. And finally, as part of states' legal obligations under international treaties such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child and CEDAW, many countries have enacted laws and established policies aimed at eliminating violence in schools, as well as other laws related to protecting girls from abuse, violence, and discrimination in their communities. However, many countries have not. In some countries, corporal punishment is still not illegal. In places, even in places where these laws have been enacted, all too often they are not implemented or enforced. Too few education systems specifically adopt or disseminate gender-sensitive child protection guidelines. And reporting and accountability mechanisms are often weak, if they exist at all. The consequences, this slide with the consequences, are immediate, short-term, and long-term. The health consequences include STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and unwanted early pregnancies, psychological suffering, poor performance at school, absenteeism, and high dropout rates, which reduces the chances for young people, and particularly rural girls, to find decent jobs and lowers their lifetime income earning capacity. So now it's time for solutions. Teachers, proven policies and programs can transform schools and the communities around them into safer places. teachers have and can be engaged as critical allies in stopping violence against children. This is important to note because through our Learn Without Fear campaign, when it's a very fine line between criticizing the role of teachers and using teachers as allies in the teachers' unions. So this is important to recognize. Not only are they perpetrators, but they are definitely our allies in fighting this. Schools can act as catalysts for nonviolence, tolerance, and gender equality, not only within their walls, but within their families and across the broader community as well. Attitudes and behaviors that justify the use of violence are learned and can be transformed. Facilities whose weak institutional capacity and poor infrastructure make boys and girls vulnerable to violence can be reformed, and programs and policies that offer support for victims and establish accountability for perpetrators can be strengthened, and indeed become a standard part of education systems and community-based child protection mechanisms. This report is aimed at solutions. It draws on what governments have done. It proposes fundamental policy principles that are built on promising practices, and it focuses on countries that are showing leadership in tackling school-related gender-based violence. Drawing upon these examples, as well as global civil society campaigns and international instruments, the report outlines specific recommendations in quite a bit of detail, which I can't get into here, but hopefully you can access the report and see the detailed recommendations. And these are for governments to establish policy foundations as a catalyst for change. Learning from our field experiences within PLAN and across the international community and listening to the voices of girls, the report calls on governments to prioritize a set of actions that will protect children from GBV on their way to school and in and around their schools. So while governments are by no means the entire solution, they are an important part of it, and when the appropriate legislative frameworks, policies, systems, and services are in place, both at the national and local level, and there is a strong commitment on acting on them, institutions, communities, parents, and children are empowered to come together and confront violence and discrimination that is limiting to so many of them. So we think it's important at targeting the government level and working with our other programming that looks at it from a community level and drawing on the experiences of both to strengthen the situation. So the 8 principles, I'm on the slide with the 8 principles, are number 1, that governments must adopt a comprehensive, integrated, and multi-sectoral action plan to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. Laws must explicitly protect children from violence, ensure accountability, and treat all children equally. Reporting and response mechanisms must be clear, confidential, proportionate, and consistent with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Policy interventions must be supported by sufficient and credible data. The data is a consistent problem with child protection, all of child protection issues, and definitely we need to strengthen our data collection. Teachers and school administrators must be well trained, equipped, and supported to prevent and respond to gender-based violence in and around schools. Law enforcement, the judiciary, child protection authorities, the transportation sector, the civil society organizations must be partners in addressing the vulnerability of children. Basically what we're referring here to is the child protection systems approach. Whole communities, including men and boys, the critical role of men and boys must be involved to change harmful attitudes and shift social norms. And finally, girls and boys must be recognized as key participants in developing any solutions. I think I went very quickly through that, but on the last slide you'll just see the link to the Canadian edition of the report, and we will have it available, the global version, in February. You still there?
Hi Tanya, thanks a million. It's a bit difficult for Tanya, she can't see us. So that's obviously, I'd say, probably a very strange presentation that you've just had to do. Listen, Tanya, thanks so much. I think, you know, in a very succinct, short period, you have run through, you know, a very complex issue. I think there's probably an awful lot of questions that we want to ask you. I know we have 10 minutes of Tanya's time before she has to rush off to a meeting, so I'm not going to say very much because I'm sure there's a lot of questions here. So do you have any questions for Tanya? Just for myself personally, something that struck me on one of those last slides was, attitudes and behaviours can be transformed. And, a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in our country programmes, an awful lot of the time it's put, oh, well, that's our culture, that's the way it's done, or it's so normalised that it's not seen as wrong. And I think it's a huge challenge for us. But I think the thing to remember is that it is learned behaviours. And then the critical challenge is, how do you actually then influence change and transformation in terms of attitudes and behaviours?
Yeah, I think, and just in that term, our schools are the place also of socialization and reinforcing those. So our schools are a conduit for changing social norms as well.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in our programming because we've primarily worked with children as conduits of change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where, that the school and the community, they're not so disconnected. There is, that whole reflection. And I think in terms of our responses then we need to be thinking about that within the school and within the wider society. We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Jessica from Plan Ireland, and I just started by thanking you for delivering such a good presentation at the last minute notice. I wanted to ask about teachers and their role in GBV, in that I've read reports and case studies about the increase of female teachers has a huge reduction on GBV, but the correlation isn't necessarily that simple. So I was wondering if you could maybe explain that a bit more to the research that you've done in Canada.
In Canada.
Or that you've learned from the programme countries.
Yeah, in the Canadian context, we didn't look so much at the difference between teachers and male and female teachers, because most of the gender-based violence that is occurring in the Canadian schools are by children themselves perpetrating it to each other through cyberbullying and other forms of bullying. So teachers' awareness, of course, female teachers might be more tuned in to the developmental stages of girls and the girl-to-girl bullying, which is a very interesting phenomenon that we've been looking at. But in terms of globally, female teachers, we have seen that having more female teachers obviously reduces some of the risk. However, female teachers are also targeted for gender-based violence when they are in isolated locations. So we also have to keep that into consideration, the risk that we're putting them into as well, and try to address that as well. But female teachers, we had a young woman from Pakistan here in Canada when we were launching this report. And in Pakistan, girls and boys are in separate schools. They don't study together. And it was female teachers in the Pakistani girls' schools that were using gender-based violence and violence against girls, in different forms, more in verbal harassment but also in physical forms as well. So we can't guarantee, because women are also just reinforcing the societal norms that they have been ingrained with. So they're not automatically going to protect girls because they might not know better.
My name is Sarah. I'm from Trocra. I'm an INGO here in Ireland. I was just saying it's putting everyone off asking questions because we have to come to the top of the room to ask them. Tanya, you have two questions. One is on the engaging teachers. As you said, there's a fine line between teachers as perpetrators and teachers as allies. And I wonder just about some of the incentives to get teachers on board and what your research has shown, and some good practice on getting teachers, I suppose, on board as allies and to stand up to GBV. And then my second question is, I suppose, the link between corporal punishment and gender-based violence and the acceptability. I recently returned from Kenya, and what really struck me was all the children I spoke to, corporal punishment was completely acceptable, but they kept making a differentiation between where you were beaten, whether it was considered punishment or discipline, in inverted commas, or actually violence. And corporal punishment was okayed in Kenya until the new constitution in 2010, but that doesn't seem to have filtered through yet. And I just thought it was very interesting to hear children and parents talk about beating on the back of the legs was okay, beating on the head wasn't. But it just seemed to legitimise violence across the board. And I just wonder, did your research look at any countries where corporal punishment has been outlawed for a good few years and what effect that has had on GBV and the links between the two? I know GBV stems from unequal power relations and corporal punishment is a different thing, but I'm just interested in the connection between the two, and maybe Mairead has something to say about that as well later on.
That's an actually very interesting question. Just for the second one on the corporal punishment, I'm just wondering, actually, can I ask you a question? Whether the Kenyan children mentioned, was there any different forms? Did the girls, was the corporal punishment executed the same way for girls and boys?
Oh, good question. I don't think I can answer that actually. All I know is there was different. It seemed to depend on where on the body you were beaten or hit, but I don't think we explored in enough detail. The different forms of punishment. I think it's an interesting thing to definitely explore further. So no, I don't have an answer to that. But definitely they just spoke about beating on the legs was fine, but any part of the upper body, well, particularly the head, wasn't. But no, we didn't look at it from a girl boy.
Because our research showed that just the forms of violence that teachers use may be gendered as well. So if in corporal punishment or physical punishment for boys, but then verbal and psychological punishment for girls, potentially more. Teachers demeaning girls, which can fall under corporal punishment or gender-based violence. The line is very unclear between the two of them, but using the forms in which they try to discipline or what they think is disciplining can actually have very detrimental effects, because girls start to internalize a lot of that feeling of negative self-worth that teachers perpetuate as a form of discipline. And boys often get more of the physical brunt of the punishment. But we haven't, unfortunately, Emily Laurie, who would have been presenting here, is more familiar with our Learn Without Fear campaign. And there might have been, they've been looking at GBV as well within the overall violence context in schools. And we were just starting a more in-depth research project in Asia, in 5 countries in Asia, on gender-based violence in schools, and probably, I think we're looking at the link between corporal punishment as well. So I don't have the data for that, but I definitely will follow that. And it's interesting that you raised it as well. In terms of engaging teachers and incentives, this is again, in our Learn It Without Fear campaign, in the West African region, we had a lot of feedback when we were developing this report that be careful what you're saying about teachers, and they tried to water down our statements about what teachers were doing, because every time they raised the issue, the teachers unions would push back. They said that we'll work with you, but you can't put us in such a negative light. And again, it was very difficult because that teachers were the perpetuators in many circumstances. So how do you not actually bring that to the forefront in order to address it? So I think they would know. Again, I haven't been working in the West African context on our Learn Without Fear campaign, but I think some of our colleagues, and if you're interested, maybe Suzanne we can try and find you more information on that later after this, to see what are some of the innovative and incentive practices that they've used with teachers in order to engage them better. Okay.
My name is Ade. I was sent here from Commonwealth Women's Organization in Nigeria. My question is the part of where we support them with our well-behaved and everything. I mean the children. You know, there's some children that they pretend like at home they behave well, you know, they behave as if everything is okay, but when they get out there to school, there was something else. What can we, actually do to that?
Sorry, I wasn't hearing everything. You were saying that there are some children that are well behaved at home.
At home, yeah, because maybe the parents supported them with support them at home. They're well behaved. They have good home training, But when they get out there to college or to school or meet friends, they change. The way they behave is different. Like outside, they behave different. Inside, at home, they behave different. What can we do to, help such?
Yeah, if you're looking for more of what a parent can do, I think it's just engaging parents overall in just understanding GBV and what their children are exposed to, and also perpetuating potentially within the school context. Parents need to be informed with what's going on in their schools, being engaged. In the Canadian context, we were saying that they're meetings with their teachers, talking to their vice principals, which in the Canadian context is usually the person in the school who has been assigned any type of violence or disciplinary behavioral that portfolio, to know what tools and what mechanisms are there, but also to know fully, in an honest, open dialogue with the school how their child is performing, or if their child is being bullied. Because some children, due to social stigma, due to fear, they're not going to necessarily tell their families either. So it goes either way. They're probably not going to tell if they are the perpetrators of violence. In the developing country context, we also promote that parents are involved in parent-teacher associations and school management committees as much as possible to ensure that they're engaged in their students' education. But it's without that parental engagement, it's difficult to know, for teachers also to know how the students are behaving at home. But hopefully, if they have that good relationship with the parents, they're able to bring that up and communicate that, and together work out some type of plan to address it.
Thank you.
Hi Tanya, how are you doing? I know you have to go.
Yeah, is there another question? I do have to go soon, but I could take potentially one more question.
I mean, I think that last question as well links in terms of the whole performance of masculinities and femininities, and the pressure on young people to behave in a certain way when they're with their peers, and so it's around that space too. And I was going to ask you about, you mentioned the critical role of work with men and boys, and have you any interesting kind of approaches maybe in terms of engaging with boys as a particular group on this issue? Or
yeah, I think one of our colleagues, or one of the partner organizations that launched this report with us, was the White Ribbon Alliance. So in the Canadian context, definitely we will be working closely with them in the policy, in the follow-up discussions with government, that men and boys are engaged in the entire process, a consultative process to develop any kind of action plan in Canada. We can't deny the whole issue of masculinities is critical to gender-based violence. So they need to be equal partners at the table, and not only looked at as villains or perpetrators, but as people that are willing to look at their social norms, because boys are equally negatively affected by these masculine roles that they are expected to fulfill. And it limits to them as well. Part of that, in the Canadian context at least, we are looking at transforming school cultures and healthy relationships. There's been a lot of programs that the White Ribbon Alliance has been involved in establishing healthy relationships at school. So there's a lot of best practices in this type of context. I know in our Learn Without Fear campaign as well, we've been looking at engaging men and boys a lot more, and we actually released last year our annual Because I'm a Girl report, or the Status of the World's Girls report, looked at engaging men and boys. It was entitled, So What About Boys? Because a lot of people do ask us that when we talk about our Because I'm a Girl campaign, and a whole report is dedicated to that. So if that's available on our website as well, on the global website. My client colleagues can probably direct you to that.
Great. Listen, Tanya, thank you so much. It was very last minute. I think it's really interesting in terms of reinforcing the global nature of school-related gender-based violence. Maybe slightly different manifestations and different forms, but every context we work in is going to be slightly different. So it's really important that, even if you have a model or approach, that whether it's Kenya or Liberia, the context and the historical nature of a country and what's happening there will have implications for issues around violence and how that's impacting different groups. So thank you so much, Tanja. It was a pleasure having you. I'm delighted the technology held up. I think we did quite well. So thanks a lot. We'll stay in contact. Suzanne here can be our key link for all of those great resources. The plan resources are really meaty. There's a lot of information in them and they're definitely worth looking at. So thanks, Tanja. Have a good day.